A federal judge holds the government responsible for mistakes it made that allowed the Sutherland Springs shooter to obtain his firearm, and a conversation with Tiffany Johnson of Rangemasters. That and more on this episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast.
I made the devil run. I gave him poison.
All right, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast. My name is Stephen Gutowski. I am your host, as well as the founder of thereload.com. And today we're going to be talking a little bit about some big news out of the federal courts. It's the first time ever a federal judge has ruled that the government can be held liable for mistakes made during the background check process related to a mass shooting. In Sutherland Springs, the shooter there obtained his gun even though he was a prohibited person based on his criminal record while he was serving in the Air Force. He had a domestic violence conviction. He spent over a year in military prison for it and received a dishonorable discharge, which should have made him ineligible to buy firearms. And the problem was when he did go to buy his firearms that he used to commit the mass shooting, which left 25 people dead and 20 more injured. It's one of the most horrific attacks on, random innocent people in American history. When he went to buy his firearms to carry out that attack, he passed his background check. He bought his guns from a retailer who ran a background check on him through the FBI's National Instant Criminal Background Check System, NICS. And NICS did not find any disqualifying records. Now, of course, he still wasn't legal for him to buy these guns, but there was no way for the store that sold him the guns to know that because the Air Force never shared his criminal records with the FBI. And this was a very pervasive problem up to this point when it came to military records being shared with the FBI for the background check system. And so this guy was able to get his guns and then carry out his attack. And victims' families sued the government for this failure. And United States District Judge Javier Rodriguez ruled in their favor on on Tuesday and found that the government is at least 60% liable. So these families will be able to recoup damages caused by the loss of their loved ones or by the injuries to some of the surviving victims from the government, which is, as far as I'm aware and from what experts told me from Duke University and UCLA and the Cato Institute, this is the first time that's ever happened in relation to failure regarding the background check system and the resulting murder of dozens of people. And so that could really set an interesting precedent and is likely actually to help with a similar case in Charleston, South Carolina, where the church shooting occurred, and the shooter in that case was able to obtain his gun, even though he likely would have been prohibited from doing so because of a pending criminal charge for drug possession, which should have made him a prohibited person while that case was ongoing. But the FBI in that situation made a mistake and they called the wrong police department to investigate his background, and he was able to obtain his gun and carry out his attack as well. And the victims' families in that case are also suing, and now seems likely that they may win that case as well. And that is an interesting new development because, frankly, it's fairly uncommon for the government to be held responsible for these sorts of negligence on their part. In this case, in Sutherland Springs, the judge said that essentially the department that within the Air Force that was tasked with essentially law enforcement for the section that the shooter was stationed in was understaffed and overworked. But at the same time, leadership for that department was negligent in how they allowed the how they didn't follow up to make sure that the fingerprints and criminal records for the shooter had been submitted to the FBI like they were supposed to be in the first place. And so he says, the government failed to exercise reasonable care in its undertaking to submit criminal history to the FBI. The government's failure to exercise reasonable care increased the risk of physical harm to the general public, including plaintiffs, and its failure approximately caused the deaths and injuries of plaintiffs at the Sutherland Springs First Baptist Church on November 5th, 2017. That's in his ruling. So, bottom line, the government will have to pay these victims' families for the negligence that led to this shooting occurring, and that could set a precedent for other cases to come. Probably not every case. I mean, you still are likely to have scenarios where the government could have acted to prevent someone from being able to obtain guns. For instance, with Parkland shooter, there were a number of so-called red flags. There were a number of incidents where he likely could have either been charged or involuntarily committed for domestic violence incidents or suicidal ideations that he'd made clear before the attack, but was never actually committed or convicted of a crime beforehand, and so didn't have a criminal record to disqualify him when he went to purchase his guns. Whereas in this case in Sutherland Springs, not only did he have the criminal record, but he had a pretty long one that would have disqualified him in several different ways if the Air Force had done its due diligence in submitting his records to the FBI, and they simply didn't do that. In a similar situation with Charleston, where if the FBI had not screwed up their investigation into that shooter's background, he would have been likely prevented from purchasing a gun, at least legally. And so those cases is sort of more direct negligence on the part of government agents, and those seem like a distinct situation from something like if you call the police and they don't respond in a timely manner and you suffer harm because of that, you're less likely to be able to ever hold the government liable for your harm because they don't have necessarily a duty to prevent harm from coming to you. It's more in these situations where a government agent is not performing their duties as laid out by the law, then you have a possibility of holding the government civilly liable in court over that failure. But either way, interesting, really groundbreaking development, I think, as far as it comes to government accountability for mistakes that led to the loss of life on a grand scale in this case, certainly. But I'm sure we'll see more on the Charleston case soon as well, because that was allowed to go forward in 2019 by I believe the Fourth Circuit, and so there should be a ruling in that case relatively soon. COVID has kind of slowed a lot of the courts down, but certainly that's well beyond the preliminary stages, and we would presumably get a final ruling on whether or not the FBI and government writ large can be held liable for the mistakes that led to the Charleston shooting as well. But moving on to something we covered a little bit last week, June's sales numbers came in, and they were the second best on record. But interestingly, there's something of a pattern beginning to emerge with the 2020 gun sales numbers, 2021, sorry. And I wrote about this for the members section, which, by the way, if you become a Reload member, not only will you get access to exclusive pieces like this one I'm about to talk about, but you will also get this podcast a day early on the website. So head on over to thereload.com and sign up today if you haven't already. But the trend we're seeing with 2021's gun sales are that they're not record anymore. We're not beating 2020's numbers anymore. like we were at the beginning of the year in January and February. But they are the second best numbers ever. So there's been a drop-off, and really the drop-off in June was fairly significant, almost 1 million units and guns sold, 1 million fewer in 2021 than 2020, because March 2020, we all remember how that went, was unprecedented. It's an all-time record for any month in history, and is unlikely to be hopefully replicated due to all the circumstances that motivated people to buy guns in March 2021. Same for June 2020, which is when we saw the onset of widespread rioting in the United States. That led a lot of people to buy guns in that month as well. We did not see that same level of violence occur this year, and so gun sales were down significantly. But they were still wildly elevated over what their normal level is. And I think that's probably where you're going to see 2021 end up as we move throughout the rest of this year. I wouldn't go out and sell my Smith & Wesson stock necessarily because June's gun sales were not as high as last year's. And I think it'll actually be interesting to see how the fall goes, because by the fall of 2020, we had seen a lot of the motivating factors that jumped out at Americans in the early part of 2020, the beginning of the pandemic, the racial unrest from, incidents of police brutality, the rioting, just the meat shortages, right? There was a lot that happened last year, but by the fall, a lot of that was beginning to recede, and people were, as best as they possibly could, getting, I don't know if used to living with the virus is the right phrase, but certainly adapting to the new reality of living in a pandemic. And so presumably a lot of the factors that were driving those record numbers in early 2020 had come down by the fall, just like you're seeing now in 2021. They didn't go away completely, obviously, and certainly some of the worst days for the virus were still to come by fall 2020. But certainly, I think a lot of the chaos element had been lessened by then, and it'll be interesting to see how 2021 sales numbers match up against 2020, because I think by the fall, things had normalized in the, to a certain degree at least, in motivation factors for buying guns. And so with that level of anxiety buying dying down last fall, I wonder if that will match what we see here in 2021, because that's, I think, the reason why gun sales have not been to the level of 2020 sales. It's just the chaos level is lower than it was in March or June of 2020. And so will, October, November of 2021 actually exceed the same months from the previous year? Because you obviously have what's left now beyond the lingering concerns that we still have about the pandemic and the economy and everything that's still an issue. Now we have heightened concerns about the politics, the political element, the push for gun control. Certainly President Biden is continuing to aggressively push for new gun restrictions, both legislatively, which obviously is not as likely to happen, but also through executive action, where he is likely to be able to overcome obstacles put in his way by Republicans or gun rights activists generally. And so with that continuing to occur, you might actually see an elevated sense of urgency to purchase guns, especially certain kinds of guns, pistol-braced firearms for one this fall than you saw even in the run-up to the election last year, because the election, as much as there was a stark contrast on guns between Donald Trump and Joe Biden, it wasn't a primary issue in that election because of just everything else going on in the country. And so now, with sort of the realities of these executive actions sinking in during the fall, will that drive more people to buy guns out of concern over their availability because of President Biden's push to ban or restrict certain kinds of guns? So that's what I'm going to look for, I think, when we get here. Obviously, we're in the summer now, which is the slow season for gun sales traditionally, and the fall is when things tend to pick back up, and so you should expect to see higher sales coming anyway. But will they exceed 2020, or will they stay on track to be like this recent trend where they're second best ever, but the second best is still way higher than the previous years in 2019, 2018, 2017. Obviously, I cover a little bit more about this. I had an exchange with Larry Keane of the National Shooting Sports Foundation, which is the gun industry's trade group, where he describes, how these sorts of things usually level out after a big surge. And so you should head on over there and check that piece out. There's also the piece on the federal judge's first of a kind ruling. So head on over to thereload.com if you haven't already read these pieces, and check them out today. And again, join if you want this podcast today early and you want access to these sorts of extra special analysis pieces that I do for the members. So, and you'll also get, of course, the weekly members newsletter where I go in more depth on the analysis side of things as well. But all that said, let's move on to our special interview this episode with Tiffany Johnson of the Rangemaster's training program, and so much more, really. She really, I think, will give us a lot of really interesting insights into black gun ownership, gun culture 2.0, the polarization of guns, too. We talk about a lot of interesting things. So let's head on over there now. We're here with Tiffany Johnson from Rangemasters, and we're going to talk a little bit about gun culture 2.0 today, as well as outreach to minority groups and black gun ownership in America. So, Tiffany, can you tell us just a little bit about yourself for listeners who might not know you?
Sure. Well, my name is Tiffany Johnson, and I am a reformed anti-gunner, I guess. I started out afraid of guns, was definitely not a gun person for the first half of my life. And I'm actually still not really a gun person, although that might surprise some people. So if you're curious why I say that, maybe we can jump into that a little later. But
Sure.
But I do train quite a bit, and I'm now an instructor for Rangemaster. When I decided I was going to take a class despite my fears, I just so happened by sheer dumb luck to walk into Rangemaster and take my very first class with the one and only, the famous, the incomparable Tom Givens. I didn't have any idea who he was at the time, but he, for some reason, took me under his wing, and we've been close ever since. He's an esteemed mentor of mine, and I guess the rest is history. It was through Rangemaster that I met Akil Kadir, who is the owner of Citizen Safety Academy. He and I both are Rangemaster certified master instructors, and I teamed up with Akil, and so now not only do I help Tom and Lynn Givens with Rangemaster events, but I also teach through Akil's company, which is Citizen Safety Academy.
Wonderful. And you guys have some events coming up soon, right?
Yeah, we've got a lot going on. Actually, Akil was really focused this year for 2021 on hosting other instructors. So we're bringing in a ton of folks who have got some national name recognition. The idea there was to kind of expose our local community and the region to some of the trainers that we revere and that we train with so often. So we've got this weekend, actually, Chuck Haggard is coming in, and we're bringing in John Johnston and Brian Hill and John Murphy is coming. So we've got a lot of guest instructors coming in. But our standard fare is basic entry-level permit style classes. Tennessee, just as of July 1, has now gone permitless. Not quite full constitutional carry, but it is now a permitless carry state. So we're tweaking our curriculum a little bit to accommodate that change in the law. But that's kind of our sweet spot where Akil and I teach. We like working with brand new shooters. So the other thing that we're focusing on this year is training up new instructors, particularly to teach new shooters, because we think that's a very nuanced skill that not everybody is very good at, and not everybody enjoys.
Certainly, and you have a particular focus on instructors for the new demographics that are coming into the gun owning community at a higher rate now, as sort of gun culture 2.0, as a lot of people have called it. More minorities, more women, people from more urban areas rather than rural areas. That sort of thing. Younger people. What's the goal there? What are you trying to accomplish with that program of training these new instructors?
Right. Well, so it may seem like a distinction without a difference, but we think it really does matter. I do want to make sure it's clear that we're not so much focused on training Black instructors or female instructors, or training instructors to work with any particular racial or gender demographic, but instead, more broadly, what we hope to do is make instructors writ large aware of the ways that they may subconsciously limit their target market, and kind of help people see what their blind spots are and ways that they can make their services and their products that they offer more attractive to non-traditional gun owners, new gun owners, all of the folks that you just mentioned. So we are definitely not advocates of any kind of separation, and we certainly don't advocate for any distinction in the techniques that are taught to one demographic or another, and that includes gender. I teach women basically the exact same way I teach men. But we do want instructors of the Gun Culture 2.0 community to understand how that community receives instruction differently than training communities of old, and also how we can tweak our teaching styles so that we lend ourselves more to a universality of application rather than just speaking towards one narrow group of people.
Okay, I see. So it's not so much about training instructors to help a particular demographic of people. It's more about training instructors to be able to speak to all sorts of different demographics of people. That's how you see it? That's
right, absolutely. Okay. And I don't mean to split hairs here. I mean, I certainly we own the fact that our training attracts non-traditional gun owners, like all the demographics you named: Black folks, young folks, urbanites, millennials, women. We're proud of that, but we are not exclusionary, and we're not training those folks at the expense of or to the exclusion of anybody else. In fact, what our primary goal is, our big overreaching umbrella goal, is to bring the different groups together so that they realize what Akil and I have come to realize, which is they're not really as different as they think they are. They're just separate, and separate is different from actually being different. As I gravitate towards one group or another, it baffles me how often they say the same things, they express the same concerns, and they have the same fears, the same priorities, even despite hailing from different demographics or even different political persuasions. And so we would love for our students to see that and to celebrate it and to realize, hey, there's not much of a difference between us after all. I know that sounds really cliche and almost corny, but it's actually true. And if we want to shore up the Second Amendment for generations to come, I think it would behoove us as a community to embrace that and own it and use it to our advantage.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, so what are some of the things that you do differently to try and have this cross demographic appeal, this cross partisan appeal that you're going for? What are a few of the things that are sort of holding back traditional gun training, and what are the things that you guys are doing different to try to break through that?
Yeah, so it's sometimes it's really simple things, and it may feel like it's touchy-feely or overly sensitive. And I know that that's sometimes taboo in the traditional gun community, but I think that sensitivity to these different backgrounds is important. So it can be something as simple as who's greeting people when your students come through the door, what photos are posted on the wall, or what books are on the shelf, or what posters do you have framed in your training space or in your gun store if you're a retailer. What products are you offering, and do they appeal to people from all kinds of different backgrounds? What music are you playing when people walk through your doors? I think that we trainers and retailers in the gun community, we should try and diversify ourselves and kind of think about, well, am I just going to play the music that I want to hear, or am I going to change it up from day to day and maybe play things that my customers or my students may want to hear, even if it's not my favorite type of music?
Interesting. And so you've been doing this for a while now, right? And you've become one of the most prominent African American women in the training space at this point. You were just in Shooting Illustrated, an article by famous trainer Mayuda Saab, or I think I butchered his name, but
Masad Ayub. Got it switched
I sort
around
of mixed
there.
up the syllables there. But but obviously very well known, very well respected trainer, and he wrote a piece on this topic where he quoted you. So I wonder, in your experience now, what have you seen change for the better or for the worse over the last period of years that you've been doing this?
Sure. So there's been a lot of change for the better, and I think, ironically enough, much of the impetus for that change has also brought about some change for the worse. And a lot of that has to do with political wins of late. So during the Obama years, there was a huge swing to the right by general, kind of mid-range conservatives as a reaction to Obama. And then in the Trump era, there was a giant swing to the left. And so the middle has been kind of vacated. And I think that can be a potential problem for us, because it just sort of carves out a huge space where there's no commonality. So the upside is that we've seen, as you indicated, with gun culture 2.0, and I think there's an argument to be made that we're encroaching upon gun culture 3.0. There's been a huge upswing in firearm sales and an explosion of new gun owners. And again, a large percentage of those new gun owners are non-white, non-male, non-traditional, not your standard stereotypical kind of card-carrying NRA member.
Right.
So that's great. I think the increase in numbers is great, and I also think the increase in diversity is great. The downside... Go ahead.
I just wanted to touch on that, the core of what you were saying there about essentially polarization of gun ownership in America, right?
That's the downside, yeah.
Yeah, you've seen certainly... you've had, I think, a lot of people fall into the idea on both sides, really, of the aisle, that guns are really just for Republicans. Conservative Republicans are the only people who should own guns or can own guns or whatever. So you see that obviously as a significant roadblock to expanding gun ownership, right? But obviously you have people who argue that, Democrats or liberals should not be welcomed in the gun community because they support policies that, or at least vote for people who support policies that would restrict gun ownership. What do you think about those kinds of arguments that these, they're sort of, I don't know, that they're not voting in the interest of gun owners, so they shouldn't be, catered to in the gun industry or the gun owning community?
Right. It's a tantalizing argument, but at the end of the day, I do not subscribe to that argument for a lot of reasons. I think that argument may feel right and apt in the short term or as a kind of knee jerk. But if we step back and look at the situation dispassionately and logically and strategically, I think it's in our best interest to have as many people exposed to firearm ownership as possible. If we have any hope of gaining trust of folks who, as of right now, vote against the interests of gun ownership, the best way to do that is to expose them to gun ownership. We're never going to have anyone vote in our interest who knows nothing about firearms. I very rarely vote in favor of things I know nothing about. So that's just human nature. It would be irresponsible to do anything otherwise. So I think we kind of shoot ourselves in the foot if we kind of excommunicate anybody who doesn't automatically vote the way we want them to, then we're kind of cutting off our nose to spite our face.
Right. And, another interesting aspect of the whole polarization of gun ownership in America is that it kind of fell to the wayside, I feel like, over the last year, right? Once people were presented with an emergency situation like we saw, obviously, with coronavirus, and then also with the instances of police brutality that led presumably a lot of minorities to buy guns as well, and then rioting that led other people, all kinds of people to buy guns in the wake of the riots we saw last year. It seemed like that was enough to push people out of this sort of partisan way of looking at gun ownership. Do you think that's part of the reason why we had that big gun surge, that people have looked beyond the politics when sort of the safety is on the line, or at the very least they don't feel safe? And then in addition to that, obviously one of the fastest growing demographics during that surge, according to the National Shooting Sports Foundation, was Black Americans. And so, obviously you don't expect you to speak for every Black American in the country.
Thank you for that, because some people ask me to do that, and I'm like, I don't know.
Right. Yeah, Black people are not a monolith. And there are a lot of different reasons why Black people might buy guns or not buy guns, just like white people or Asian people or any other kind of person.
Absolutely.
But certainly I would imagine you have a better insight into the community than I do on this topic. So I just wanted to get your thoughts as to what, was it just the sort of being faced with uncertainty and wanting to protect themselves and their families that drove Black Americans to buy guns last year? Was it police brutality incidents? Obviously, Derek Chauvin and George Floyd in Minneapolis was massive national news. And there was a whole movement surrounded by Black Lives Matter movement that surrounded that. What did you see as sort of the big reasons why people from the Black community started buying guns more? Because it seems like there was at least a fairly significant shift in attitudes about gun ownership, because traditionally Black Americans have been less likely to, or been more likely to support stricter gun laws at the very least.
Right.
In modern times.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. I think that it became a matter of prioritizing safety, and people realized the extent to which their safety and the safety of their nuclear family was first and foremost their own responsibility. I think it began to occur to folks that, I'll just call the police is not is not a cure for everything that could possibly confront the average American family. And in more cases than not, if your safety is in danger right now, you have to do something about it before the police can get there. Or there's a small sliver of the community that now doesn't any longer trust the police to have their safety at the forefront. And I'm not here to talk on whether or not that's a valid concern, but as far as just the impetus for buying guns, that plays a role. I don't know that it is.
And I would say too that that's not necessarily an uncommon concern among a certain section of gun owners, regardless of race, right? Is this concern about government overreach, and that these are a lot of things that people feel that motivate people to buy guns.
So this is a perfect example of what I was mentioning earlier about how the seemingly disparate groups aren't as different as they may think. Your average kind of middle-aged conservative Republican white guy who says, I don't want the government messing with my business, is not preaching much different sermon than the liberal, young, urbanite black guy who says, I don't want the cops coming in my house. It's kind of the same theme, albeit maybe coming from different origins or expressed in different ways. But the other thing I was going to mention, though, with the surge in gun ownership and gun purchases, I don't think it's nearly as political as traditional gun owners might assume. One difference that I have noticed and I'm speaking in broad generalizations here, there's obviously exceptions to every rule, but I'll just say for sake of simplicity, in the pro-gun community and the quote-unquote anti-gun community, one distinction that does exist is the tendency is higher in the pro-gun community to be a single-issue voter. And I think a lot of pro-gun advocates assume that anyone who owns a gun is going to let that right take precedence over any other consideration that dictates how they vote. In the anti-gun community / new gun owning community, that's not the case. We don't always have the luxury of being single issue voters. So whereas some of my friends let the buck stop with who's going to be the best advocate for my Second Amendment rights, and that determines who they vote for, I'm not a single issue voter. I've got to weigh that against a dozen different factors that also are very important and highly prioritized when I do the calculus to ultimately figure out where I'm going to cast my vote. So it's not as simple as, well, you own guns now, so why would you vote for somebody who supports gun control? That's a gross oversimplification of the consideration that most people have to put into their voting decisions. Sure,
that makes sense. So I guess one question I have for you here is, in your view, like where should we go from here? Where should the gun industry and the gun rights movement go from here? What do you want to see more of?
I would love to see the gun owning community take more pride in the growth of gun ownership across the nation and leave politics out of it, at least at first glance. I think one mistake that we often make in the gun community is we go straight to politics, and if I happen to meet somebody at my office who says, hey, I bought a gun this weekend, and we strike up a conversation about that, I shouldn't be talking politics 30 seconds into that conversation. All I need to concern myself with is just what do we both know in common about guns? What do we both want to learn about guns? What can we share? What experiences do we share in terms of motivations for purchasing firearms? And leave all of the voting and the politics out of it. that doesn't come into play until you know somebody so well that you would feel totally comfortable asking them about their religion or their love life. If you're not that cool with the person, then you don't need to be discussing how they vote with them. So I really think that we need to kind of crawl before we walk, before we run, before we fly, in terms of how we're going to best preserve the Second Amendment from the perspective of the gun community. Stop worrying so much about immediately bashing people over the heads with vote this way, vote this way, vote this way, and instead just be a human being, be a neighbor, be a coworker. And it's a much more powerful message for someone who's known you for 2 years and gone to work with you every day to suddenly say to you, wow, I didn't know you carried a gun, as opposed to you beating people over the head with that from out of the gate and expecting them to just, succumb or cede the floor to you. Because what happens when people make that face and they say, wow, I didn't know you were a gun owner. What that means is I didn't realize that guns belonged in the hands of people like you, because you're like me. So I thought that everybody who owned a gun was different from me. That's really what's going on in a person's head who says, with an eyebrow raised, I didn't know you carried a gun.
Right. That makes sense. Absolutely. And so what, I guess, what are some of your advice for trainers out there, for, other firearms trainers or gun store owners or employees? If someone comes into their shop that's a different gender or race or ethnicity or whatever background than they're used to seeing in their store, or than they're used to training. What are some of the ways that they can help make that person feel comfortable there? What are some of the things that they might do unknowingly to make them uncomfortable? What's some of the advice that you would give to other people in the gun industry in that regard?
Yeah. So the first thing should go without saying, but it doesn't. The first thing is greet the person and be nice. Be just as nice to that person as you would be to your VIP customers, or the people who take your classes every week, or the people who buy from your store every week. Don't assume that person is just sightseeing or on some kind of field trip. Try and make that person a loyal customer the same way you would anyone else who walks through the door. And the reason I say greet them, show them respect, and show them your interest in making them a customer, is because I can't tell you how many times I've been treated otherwise myself. I've gone into countless gun stores and watched, just as a plain old people watching experiment, watched as the gun store employees saw to other customers before they saw to me. Now, I don't have enough information from those situations to accuse those people of being racist or sexist. I have no idea why they ignored me. I have no idea if it had anything to do with my race or my gender or anything else for that matter. But all I know is that, one, they opened the door for me to speculate about those things. And two, they lost my trust as a customer. Because now it doesn't matter what the answer to the question is. If I have to ask myself the question, why hasn't anyone come over to help me? Then the customer service agent, whether it's an instructor or a sales clerk, has failed. So that would be my first thing. Flash a smile, be genuine, be yourself. A lot of people, when I talk about how to greet customers, they fear that I'm asking people to be fake or inauthentic somehow. Nothing could be farther from the truth. Be yourself, because people will smell BS on you if you try to play a role or wear a mask. So be your true self, but also just be polite, be a considerate human being. Be a little cautious about how many F-bombs you drop or how many distasteful comments you make about women. Again, not telling you that you can't make crude jokes. I make crude jokes myself all the time. But you do that in company that you're familiar with and comfortable with, not in front of total strangers whose opinions you don't know. So that's kind of where I would start.
It sounds a lot like just having some basic empathy, or being considerate is kind of the key to what you're what you're talking about there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll say one other thing real quick on that topic. The other important part is don't be afraid to ask questions or to admit when you're wrong, because we all do it. And it's really awkward if you make an assumption about somebody and find that assumption to not be true. Then the first thing people do is start getting defensive or try to justify the assumption or something like that. Instead, I think the better way to go about it is to just say, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. I don't know what got into me. That was the dumbest thing. I forgive me. I said that. There's no reason for it. I'm an idiot. I'm sorry. Let's start all over. How are you today? And just move on. Or if someone's different from you and you're not sure how to navigate that, vis-a-vis something related to the sale or to the class, just ask, because most people don't mind and would rather you ask than assume. We had a wheelchair bound student one time, and Akil and I were like, I have no idea what do we need to change. We're not sure how to handle this, and we spent some time going back and forth, and finally we were like, let's just call her. So we called and we said, hey, look, tell us what you need. And first of all, she thanked us for asking her. And secondly, it turned out that she needed a whole lot less than we thought, because again, there we go, assuming that because there are differences on the surface, that requires a whole lot of, change as far as how we operate. And it usually doesn't. There were one or two accommodations we had to make, and it was super simple. And other than that, we just conducted the class the same way we always do. And the same is true on the retail floor or, on the range.
So is this, I guess, the sort of thing you're talking about here, maybe like with women in gun stores, often you hear a lot of trying to push them towards the pink gun or the smallest gun that's available, and it's which is not necessarily always the best course of action for someone, especially if they're buying their first gun. Giving them a really small gun can often be harder to handle in a lot of cases, and there's sort of assumptions made about women and what in those ways. Is that sort of one of the things you're talking about here too?
Definitely. It's another instance where it's better to ask than to assume. So rather than assuming that a woman, because she's a woman, wants a gun with some ridiculous coat of paint on it, just ask her. Say, what are you interested in? What have you shot before? What are you looking for? Do you have any idea what your preferences might be? Have you ever shot before? And then go from there.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of it just kind of sounds like how you should deal with everybody who walks in your store. It does,
right? And that's kind of the frustrating part, is because the answers to some of these questions are so simple that, again, it seems like I dare call it common sense, but it should go without saying, and yet it has to be said. So I'll keep saying it if people ask, but I don't know. I think people just get uptight when it comes to things like race, gender, sexuality, sexual orientation, just because we've been so swept up in identity politics for so long that now it's almost like walking on eggshells. And I think everybody needs to just kind of relax, take a deep breath, exhale, and just deal with people on a human basis rather than, oh, there's a black person in my store, or what should I change? It's treat everybody like a human being, and your chances go way up of not offending that person.
Well, I mean, that makes a lot of sense, honestly. It's a very simple sort of advice you've got there for how to improve things, which I guess on a certain level is good, because, it's not complicated necessarily to try and make things better when it comes to, how you treat sort of these gun culture 2.0 demographics if you haven't had experience with them before coming into your store or doing your training. Although I will say, like, at this point, I imagine unless you're living in an area that doesn't have a lot of diversity in it, you probably, if you're in the gun industry, have dealt with a lot of diverse people from all kinds of backgrounds. I mean, in my experience, and now I live in Northern Virginia, which happens to be probably a more diverse area in terms of race and religion and so forth than some other areas, but shooting has been one of the most diverse activities that I engage in, up there with like football fandom, sports,
yeah.
Right. But snowboarding is much less diverse than like I go to the range. There's all kinds of people there, and the people who run my local store are used to dealing with that at this point. But yeah, I mean, I guess with this latest surge, perhaps there were areas where people had new customers. They just didn't understand. They weren't used to dealing with them. And I think it makes sense what you're saying, that like they got, this is something new to me, and maybe they try to, the way they handle it doesn't work out well.
Yeah.
And the key is to just trying to have some empathy and be human.
Yeah. I think as far as how much diversity you're exposed to, that really is a regional thing. I mean, if you live anywhere close to even a medium-sized city, you're going to have way more diversity than if you live in places that are more sparsely populated.
Sure.
I can drive 100 miles from here and meet people who have never laid eyes on a black person before. So it just depends on where you are. It's been very recently that I've walked into an establishment that was full of white people and gotten the stares that, again, I can't read people's minds, but that I interpreted as, well, this is something new, never seen her. She's not from around here. So that happens even today. And again, people are sensitive about this stuff. And I want to make it clear that reaction from folks does not make them racist. Noticing something different in your environment is a good thing. That's what we teach our students to do. It doesn't, if you happen to notice that there's a black person walking around and there usually aren't any black people walking around, that's fine. It doesn't make you racist. One of my biggest pet peeves is people who claim to be colorblind. Unless you're actually blind, you're not colorblind. You totally notice what race everyone is. So there's no point in pretending that it's not a thing, because that is a thing.
No, that makes sense. As far as the industry goes, I know one of the things that gets talked about a lot with, especially with minorities and the gun industry is there's at least a lack of representation when it comes to gun store ownership. How are things when it comes to training companies and the training industry? Do you think that the industry, whether it's makers, dealers, trainers, that we need to see more of an effort put into, reaching out to communities of color and different demographics to try and bring them into ownership of gun stores or gun companies or training companies? Is that a major issue from your point of view? Is that something that still needs improvement at this point?
Yeah, I definitely
or are we
think
doing
so.
well?
We're doing better. I mean, we're moving in the right direction, but I definitely think that there's much to be gained from reaching out to communities that may not have previously considered owning a gun store or owning a training company, for all of the same reasons that diversifying the instructor community is advantageous. I think it just means the more diversity we have in the ranks, the more chances we have of reaching new folks in the broader community, of broadening, expanding our entire target market, both commercially and politically. So I don't see a downside to that at all.
Right, that makes sense.
But
I think you made a lot of good points here. But so last thing. If people want to take your class, if they want to maybe join your instructor course to sort of learn how to better incorporate different points of view and reach out to different demographics, how can they do that?
Shameless plug. Thank you. So, if you're interested in training with Rangemaster under Tom and Lynn Givens, the website is rangemaster.com. You can also follow Rangemaster's event schedule on Eventbrite at rangemaster.eventbrite.com. And locally, or I guess regionally, Akil and I are based in the Nashville area. So that's citizenssafety.com. And you can also follow us on Eventbrite, citizensafety.eventbrite.com. And we're all over social media and all of the usual online platforms. We do, Akil and I, we do travel. So if you're not in the Nashville area and you're interested in training with us, just give us a holler. You can email both of us at info@citizensafety.com. We would love to train with you.
Hey, all right. Well, Tiffany Johnson, we really appreciate you coming on and giving us your perspective. I think it's very valuable, and I think I learned a lot by hearing from you. So I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. I appreciate you inviting me.
Absolutely. I really enjoyed having Tiffany on. I think it's important to have people who've, experienced different things than you, who come at topics from a different point of view. I really want that to be part of what this podcast does, obviously as an extension of what the Reload as a whole does. And I think that I'm going to strive to try and have some people on as well that don't necessarily probably agree with a lot of the things that I do as far as, gun rights or gun control or gun legislation are concerned. That's one thing I'm going to try and bring more of to this podcast as well. It's been great having, people who I think are very knowledgeable. That's the other big thing I want for this podcast is knowledgeable people, not just, talking heads or people who want to just repeat old talking points. But I'd also like to have on people that sort of challenge the things that I believe and maybe the things that you guys believe out there. Listening, so we can have, a more full-throated conversation, a more thoroughly informed discussion. I think that's healthy. I think it's good. I think bringing on people, even if they agree with me on, my personal views about gun rights, I'm sure Tiffany and I probably have quite a lot of similar opinions on these things. It seemed that way, at least from talking with her. I've met her before, of course, but I think it'd be great to have on some people that we can really have a good disagreement, get to the core of an issue, and hash it out. I think that'll be healthy and even interesting to listen to as well. This conversation I think was very interesting to listen to, hearing someone else from a different point of view than I am, who's had different experiences in life than I have. And I think the same will be true when I bring on people from opposing points of view. As long as there can be a reasonable discussion, I think that's what I want to strive for and what I'll seek out here on the podcast. But that's it for this episode. As always, for the third or fourth time, I think I'll put the pitch in here that if you want to get this early, you can join today. And if you want extra content, exclusive access to member content, you can head on over to thereload.com and join today. But otherwise, I think we're going to have a couple professors coming up here. That should be interesting. One from Northeastern University to discuss mass shootings and coverage of them and how frequently they actually happen, whether or not they're increasing, as seems to be portrayed by the media. And then we're also going to have one from Duke University to discuss perhaps some of the big cases going through the federal court system. We talked about some of those with David French on a previous episode, which you guys can check out. It's freely available on all of the major podcasting platforms now. But we're going to go more in depth on the California assault weapons ban ruling because there's a lot of interesting stuff going on in there. And I think that will be grounds for a fruitful discussion. So make sure you tune in again next time. That is all for this week. Thank you guys for coming along and listening to what I have to say.
I made the devil run. I gave him poison just for fun. I had one friend, now there's none. I made the devil run. I broke so many bones.